It's time for the Bible Geek. We don't really know for sure what is and what is not. Holy Ghost, God, baby, God blasted my spine. Ghost, yes, friends, it's time for the Bible Geek. Bible Geek here, keeping my pledge to do a geek a day until I drain the rain barrel, and I hope to do it today. So let's get on to those exciting questions. There's one from yesterday that I noticed later. I kind of skimped on. There was a point I should have made that I didn't. It had to do with King Ahab of Israel, who's the bad guy in the Elijah stories. In First Kings, someone asked if it were possible that he might have had a history of David and Solomon, perhaps one of the sources used in Samuel and Kings, that he might have had that written in order to beef up his own royal throne and lineage, as if claiming descent from them. It didn't occur to me somehow yesterday that this couldn't really be so, because Ahab was the king of Israel, and Israel had repudiated the Davidic dynasty. They would cuss and spit anytime you mentioned David or Solomon's name, pretty much the way Southerners like me do whenever anybody mentions General Sherman. And so I should have thought of that. I don't know why I didn't. But I figured I owed you a little more on that one. Okay, here's one from David Perlmutter. There was more discussion on the Facebook page on the criterion of embarrassment. Please tell me what you think about the following. One of my problems with stating that something was embarrassing is that it assumes that the audiences for the earliest Christian stories were monolithic, as in everybody was a Roman senatorial aristocrat. We know from the first century that there were many freed slaves in the Roman Empire who were poor or lower middle class. The Romans had a law on the books that if a slave in a Roman citizen's household killed his master, then all his slaves were subject to execution. I presume the method of execution was crucifixion, though there were others. We also know that in the rare instances where this punishment was actually carried out, there were usually riots or protests by ordinary people at the cruelty of the act. My point is that the Roman world contained many constituencies that might have viewed different aspects of the Christian stories differently. It's perfectly possible that a lower or middle-class audience may not have seen anything shameful in crucifixion, knowing well by experience that many innocent people suffered it. Another audience to consider are the Jews of the Near East. They would have seen ordinary Jewish patriots crucified, and so also they would not have thought that being crucified meant you were necessarily a shameful person. In some, there may have been many groups of people in the Roman Empire who did not view the crucifixion of their hero as something to be embarrassed about. Yeah, that is so, and I think that that's a good corrective to some folks that what's his name, J.P. Holding. I know that sounded demeaning, as if he's not worth remembering. I didn't mean that. Sorry about that. I just couldn't think of it for a second. Holding, if I remember correctly, says that this religion could never have gotten off the ground. Who would have venerated a crucified Messiah and so on? Because in 1 Corinthians, of course, it implies there was something wrong with that, right? Greeks demand wisdom, Jews seek miraculous signs, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and nonsense to Gentiles. This is funny because it's like the apologetic argument, which is supposed to be taking off from neutral territory, is really just a paraphrase of something in the Bible, and the apologist figures, well, it must be true because it's in the Bible. And as you say, it needn't have been a disqualifier in the sense that people would say, well, look, if he was crucified, he must have been guilty. But I do think there is a point in this objection, and usually what we think of as what 1 Corinthians has in mind. What is the stumbling block? Well, the idea that the Messiah or the Christ was almost by definition, by job description, supposed to be the guy that kicked Roman butt. Right? If he were crucified, that means, well, okay, guess he couldn't have been the guy we were looking for, just as the two disciples on the road to Emmaus say that. You know, we had a lot of stock placed in this man. We thought he was the one to liberate Israel. But you see what happened. And of course, Jesus says, look, idiots, don't you realize that according to plan, he had to be rejected and killed, and only then would stage 2 come, he enters into his glory. And in fact, you know, it wasn't long before they see the glorified Christ for an instant before he vanishes into thin air. That seems to me to be reasonable. I mean, and of course it kind of fits with a pattern of messiahs and would-be messiahs and avatars over the centuries, all over the world, that the candidate for the great deliverer strikes out, and people just can't admit they were wrong. Well, the Emmaus disciples did, and obviously some do. People that expect the world to end as they've calculated it, like William Miller and Harold Camping, they get embarrassed, and a lot of people do just give it up and say, sheesh, how could I have been so stupid as to fall for that? But there are diehards who will dig in and say, oh, no, it happened all right. It just contrary to expectation, the messianic coming was invisible or in secret, or it didn't happen the way we thought it would. And what do you know? I guess now we realize that the Messiah did have to be crucified first, and then what we all expected will happen. That kind of thing always leads to docetism as well, right? It only seemed that he died, it was somebody else, etc. It's a way of rationalizing and picking up the pieces, because it does seem to be a big-time debunking of the whole thing. There I can see the point. I think it's in that sense that the New Testament speaks of the scandal of the cross, not that this guy was crucified, because you're right, he could have then been venerated as a martyr, but that wasn't what they were expecting. They were expecting a triumphant Messiah. So that's what I think is the force of that objection. Though you are certainly right, and Richard Carrier is right. Spartacus, right, he wound up dying on a cross, but that didn't make him any less a hero. Of course, the fact that he looked and sounded like Kirk Douglas may have had something to do with it. Okay, this next one is from Bruce. Mind if we call you Bruce? You are on record in the late and lamented Journal of Higher Criticism as suspecting the originality of 1 Corinthians 15, 3-11. Others have challenged this or that other passage within 1 Corinthians 15. I would suggest instead that the whole of 1 Corinthians 15 is an interpolation, added like all the Pauline interpolations at the time his letters were edited as a group for wider distribution. My argument is simple. 1. 1 Corinthians 15 is on a single topic, the resurrection, but it is not signaled by the otherwise ubiquitous peri de itemization marker that is now concerning, right? 2. On the contrary, it has an interruption marker. Now I would remind you, brethren, along with a reference to Paul's previous teaching. This device is standard in the pastorals and in some other interpolations in the genuine Paulines. 3, there are suspicious resemblances to doctrines otherwise known only in the Gospels, specifically in Matthew. Matthew, Gundry and I both say, was written, Robert Gundry, big commentary on Matthew, was written about 68, and the editing of Paul's letters was not complete until about 71. 68, 71. There would have been plenty of time for the Matthew material to be added to the Pauline original. For, and why? The editors show a pronounced irenic tendency to reduce disagreements among the Christians. In Romans, Paul rants against those Christians who still believe in salvation by works, and this would be an instance of harmonizing the otherwise substantially different theology of the Pauline and Gospel strands of tradition. I think Paul's editors were looking not just at the Pauline heritage, but at the Christian heritage, and by their work intending to legislate for both. Does that work for you? Well, I do think you have the Catholicizing tendency in the passage that I and others have before me have contended was an interpolation, verses 3 through 11. I mean, even just there, because that's where you have the whether it was I or they, this is what we taught and what you believed. And I taught you what I first received. This is all the Paul of Acts, Paul, the subordinate and protege of the 12 in Jerusalem. And, as Harnack pointed out, the parallel sightings of Jesus, right? He appeared to Peter, to Cephas and the 12, and to James and all the apostles. What's the difference between the 12 and the apostles? Boy, a lot has been written on that, but I think Harnack rightly saw that the apostles and the 12 are supposed to be the same people, and that what you have here is a putting together of two rival claims, two party slogans, that Peter was the head of the disciples, or Cephas, and no, it was James, and that now that water's under the bridge, the figureheads are dead, what say let's venerate them both, and so we have at least two stages of reconciliation. The rest of the chapter seems to me to be taken up in theoretical ruminations that don't exactly fit that. For one thing, the way the resurrection is viewed as essentially spiritual, that doesn't go in the direction of Catholicizing. Charles H. Talbert's great book, I'm thinking of the called Luke and the Gnostics. Yeah, that's it. He goes into how the agenda of Acts is startlingly parallel to that of second-century apologists, and that would be the case for 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 11, though I think not so much the rest of that chapter. But you could still be right, and it's not even really incompatible with my view if you are, because I see 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 11 as an interpolation into what may be an interpolation, and I think there is an interpolation into the 3 through 11 passage, namely the business of the 500 brethren, because it's the only one of these claims that does not appear to be offered as a credential claim, as in 1 Corinthians 9:1. Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? That's why these people were named in a list of official appearances to give them apostolic credentials, but then suddenly there's 500 of them. Unnamed doesn't seem to be the point. Whoever added it didn't quite grasp why the other ones were there in the first place. And plus the fact that this has to be later than the Gospels, because you tell me how, if this were a part of early tradition, that the risen Jesus was seen by a huge number of people, we would not hear of it in any Gospel. course, in fact, we do, but it's a much later one, the Gospel of Nicodemus. And I think that one of the several variant versions of it, and I think that's where it comes from. It's a development from Matthew, who has the Roman guards at the tomb, and the author of the Gospel of Nicodemus says there were 500 of them. That's who 1 Corinthians 15 is talking about, and so forth. So very fascinating. I'm glad to see other folks exploring interpolation hypotheses, whether mine or not. Thanks, Bruce. Art Caminio and Satellite Beach. Isn't a myth something that develops and evolves over a period of time rather than suddenly springing into existence at a specific point in time? Not necessarily. There are known examples of the creation of artificial gods. Glaucon, the oracular serpent god that Alexander of Aboneutychus created in the 2nd century, sending out apostles to the nations. It was a money-making scheme, apparently, but he did manage to found a cult. Also, when one of the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt combined Osiris and Apis into Serapis, well, it caught on pretty fast. And modern urban legends make it pretty obvious that it doesn't take any real time at all for somebody to mistake a piece of fiction for history and for it to enter in the public consciousness as history rather than fiction. So it needn't take very long. But let's go on. Art says, if there was no historical Jesus, then how are we to understand 1 Thessalonians, where Paul believes Jesus will return within Paul's own lifetime? Well, of course, if this is a pseudepigraph, as many scholars of various persuasions think that it is, all this means is that the writer believed that in the apocalyptic parousia, before he and his readers would die, and he's sort of forgetting that he's supposed to be Paul, who's long dead, and that would be an embarrassment if Paul had really said it, since it didn't happen. Same sort of a slip that the author of 2 Peter makes in the same way, where he says, let's see, he says that sorry, folks, I probably heard the phone there. It was the Apostle Paul calling to correct what I said, but of course that's not going to stop me, right? So what was the point there? 2 Peter. He's supposed to be Peter, and yet he says, remember how your apostles said that in the last days scoffers would come scoffing. Kind of why we call them scoffers to begin with, and that's what's happened. Then, oops, aren't you supposed to be one of those apostles from the old days? Oh yeah, same sort of thing here. Plus, I don't think in Thessalonians it speaks of the return of Christ, but rather of the coming of Christ, which sort of makes this, or his son from heaven and all that, which makes you take another look at the whole thing. What exactly does this epistle presuppose about whether there's been a first coming and so forth? It's tricky. But Art goes on, if Jesus were a myth, why would Paul believe he could set Jesus' death and second coming within Paul's own lifetime? Well, it could easily be the same factor that led William Miller and Harold Camping and others to figure that it would happen, namely some sort of calculation from the Old Testament, Daniel's 7 weeks of years or whatever. I mean, I think I mentioned the other day that it's very likely that Mark pictures Jesus basing his proclamation the time is fulfilled, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, on an Old Testament prediction, or the way they were interpreting it. So that could well be, and wherever it came from. And keep in mind that if there was no historical Jesus, the bottom drops out of it. We don't have to ask if myth could really have developed so quickly between the events and their telling, because if there weren't any events, it's myth all the way down, all the way back. Thanks, Art. David Haynes. In Genesis, God never talks to Joseph like he did to Adam, Moses, and Abraham. How come? Excellent question. I think because the further you get into recognizable historical times, even if you're still reading fiction or legend like the Joseph story, it's set in a time like the one the reader lives in, and because there's a pharaoh on the throne, and the patriarchs are around, and there's famines and stuff, where it's more like real world stuff. There's no Garden of Eden, there's no Tower of Babel, there's no prophets flying into the sky, and so they felt for narrative verisimilitude, God's intervention had to be shown taking place in the same way that it does in the reader's time, namely through dreams and prophets, and that so on through the David stories. Gad the seer and Nathan the prophet say, hey, here's what God has to say to you, or David may have a dream or a vision or something, and I think that's why. It's just verisimilitude. Okay. Also, Daniel goes on to say, is the story of Noah just a retelling of the story of Adam and Eve? They were the only humans on earth. They were given rules for eating. Both kept a garden. Fruit caused a naked man to sin, then a curse. 3 sons, one did an evil deed. Animals are part of the tale, etc. Never thought of that, Daniel. Could be. I mean, think also of the business with Lot and his daughters later on after Sodom and Gomorrah. How come Lot's daughters say there's not a man on all the earth to procreate with? Huh? Now, how'd that happen? I mean, that's almost like the where did Cain get his wife thing. You're right. Plus, the Sodom and Gomorrah story seems like it's another version of the flood story, like the idea of God coming down incognito and or his angels to check out the rumors to decide whether he wants to destroy the wicked city. That's just like Zeus and Hermes on a tour of ancient Greece to see if Zeus wants to go through with his plan to flood out the whole human race. What you say is really striking. I wouldn't be at all surprised. I know in unification theology they speak of Noah as a kind of second Adam, and therefore the Lord of the Second Advent is the third Adam, and so on. Fascinating. I think you really got something there. That is most fascinating. I mean, just like you say, so many parallels to it. I think you ought to dig into that more and do some research. That sounds great. My hat's off to you. Or it would be if I wore one. And the third, Daniel says, Joseph and Daniel seem to do a few of the same things. Know freedom, interpret dreams, get elevated to second in command, get put into a pit, one with lions, etc. Is there any type of a connection? One story copied another? Could be. There are 2 versions of Joseph's story that have been spliced together from J and E, and it makes you wonder if the Daniel story, which is based on folklore and so forth, is another version of that. But of course, it may just be that they both belong to the same literary genre, which flourished during the diaspora. To say to young Jews, stick with your religion, don't assimilate. And though you're in a minority, your excellence will bring you to the attention of the rulers, and you can advance in ways you never thought possible for a member of a conquered people. Because there are other examples, like the story of Esther is another one. So it may be that it's just that there are several versions of this, and ultimately I'm not sure if that's much different than saying that Daniel is copied from Joseph or vice versa. And so, I mean, something like that must be the case. There is a connection, either dependence or just formal similarity because of the same genre. Very good. You see, what Daniel is doing here is something I think is of utmost importance for the biblical critic, and that is to look for analogies, to train yourself to spot similarities. Things don't have to be identical to manifest all kinds of clues that they have some relationship or a similarity that is not just coincidence. So that has served me well, maybe better than anything else in my critical studies. So bravo, Daniel. This is from Roy from Portugal. I've been fascinated by your work for quite a while now, and I'm consistently astonished at your critical ability. Anybody can be a critic and criticize stuff. Sorry. You frequently endorse theories that 99% of other academics find outrageous, but I'm systematically unable to get myself to agree with the 99%. The biggest exception up to now has to do with the dating of the 7 undisputed Pauline epistles in the New Testament. As far as you know what they are, right? Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, 1st Thessalonians, wait a minute, Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, 1 Thessalonians, Philippians, and Philemon, right? As far as I can tell, your arguments for their late forgery, that is, even of those 7, revolve around apparent differences in the theological doctrines endorsed and the stage of development of the theological debate they imply. Let me just pause. And of course, those are big issues even among for Pauline scholars that say those 7 are genuine, because that's the kind of thing they use to disqualify the pastorals, Colossians, 2nd Thessalonians, and Ephesians. So, okay. However, I've never seen you address the stylistic arguments in favor of common authorship of the 7 so-called undisputed. Do you agree with those that say the stylistic analysis of the text guarantees that the 7 were, at least for the most part, written by the same person? If yes, is it only their date of composition and the identity of the author that you dispute? If not, why is a supposedly precise scientific technique such as writer verification not enough to convince you of this? Well, the big reason, I guess, is the parallel with the Johannine material. As I guess this has been pointed out before him, but it first dawned on me what I'm about to say when I was reading, I think, C.H. Dodd's commentary on the Johannine epistles, and he said it really looks like these were not written. I mean, all of them are anonymous, but it really looks like they were not written by the same person that wrote the Gospel of John, whoever that was, because the theology is just too different. It kind of sounds more like what Bultmann called the ecclesiastical redactor of John, and may have been that person. But if it isn't him, if it isn't he, I should say, why is it so similar? Well, I think the reason for that is that, and Dodd said this, is that if you're members of a common circle, a common school of thought. Even once you divide, you're going to start. You're going to have picked up a common religious vocabulary. I think that's certainly the case. If you've been, if you've made the rounds of different types of churches and so on, you'll pick up on that. So I think that's probably going on, and I think also of Ephesians, which again all critical scholars say. That's a tough thing to say. There are people that are very astute scholars like Gordon Fee, who I was privileged to have as an advisor, who believes that Paul wrote Ephesians, and though most mainstream critics say no, he didn't. And what's the issue there? Well, the vocabulary of Ephesians is much like that of Romans and Corinthians and so on, but the sentence structure is not. In fact, the first chapter of Ephesians consists of 2 hugely long sentences. And so I think Fee used to quote, was it Caird or some older British critic, that what are you going to do? Go with the 90% of it that sounds like Paul, or the 10 that doesn't? Well, I think Edgar J. Goodspeed settled that one by pointing out that Ephesians is a harmony of all the other Pauline epistles, that it was written as a kind of overture to them. In fact, in one place in Ephesians it says something about the mystery that I proclaim, the ministry given me, as you'll read about in what follows. Well, it must have headed up the collection. And so, yeah, naturally, it sounds like Paul because it's pretty much cribbed from Paul. Phrases and stuff like that, just like the little bitty epistle of the Laodiceans, which is obviously just an attempt to fill in the gap where in Colossians the writer says, when you get done with this epistle, pass it on to the folks in Laodicea, and then you read the epistle I wrote to them. What epistle? Well, somebody decided to make one up, and if you look at it, you can see instantly it's just a bunch of phrases taken from the other epistles, especially Philippians. And sure, it sounds like Paul, or like the letter of Clement of Alexandria to Theodore about the secret gospel, and the passage of the secret gospel contained in it. Yeah, it sounds like Clement of Alexandria. It almost sounds a little too much like him, as if somebody had the brand new index of Clementine vocabulary and just cribbed all the phrases from that. And the Mark passage is just a bunch of passages that occur in the same words elsewhere in the Gospel of Mark. So kind of looks like an attempt to ape the same style, in those cases by somebody that didn't trust himself to be able to do it in clear blue sky, right? Somebody that had to depend to a great degree on Pauline texts that were already in circulation. But it can, I mean, if you have studied very well, it's not that tough to mimic the Pauline style or anybody else's. I wrote a whole collection of 14 new Pauline epistles that I think pretty much do have the rhetorical style and all that of the Pauline epistles. So it seems to me the stylistic thing is not that tough to figure. Well, how about the fact that those 7 use the chiastic structure? That's not too tough to discern either, right? You might figure that among them, somebody noticed that earlier one used that, and if he wants to make it sound as much like that as he can, he'll ape that structure. The later group of forgeries didn't bother or didn't notice it. That's what I think. I mean, who knows, but it makes sense to me. Brian Sparks says, I was wondering about any possibility of relation between Gideon's 300 and Leonidas, Thermopylae and all that. Also, what are the scholarly opinions? I'm sorry, there's really two questions. I have no idea. It's fascinating because in both you do have the same notion that a small group was able to fend off and defeat this bunch of foreigners. They do it in different ways. It's the simple fury of the Spartans on the one hand and the sneaky tactics of Gideon on the other. But I don't know. I mean, there might be dependence, especially since the biblical material seems to be a lot later than we thought. That's interesting. Okay, another question from Brian. He says, what are the scholarly opinions of Zecharia Sitchin's attempts to harmonize, or whatever you call his 12th Planet books, to make sense of the Old Testament with Sumerian stories? I have only ever read one scholarly comment on it, and that was by Hector Avalos in an issue of the Journal of Higher Criticism. I don't know which one now, some years ago. I think it was in 94. And it's real good stuff. And I think I like the 12th Planet. I've never read any of the other ones. I don't accept what he's saying. It's not absurd, but it seems to me it's just something that cannot be verified. It seems kind of an arbitrary but not ridiculous interpretation, assuming that the gods and angels and so on are space aliens. Again, you'll probably be sizing me up for a straitjacket, but that's not an absurdity. I don't believe it's true, and I don't know how you could ever establish such a thing. But I don't think the evidence, if there is any, is unequivocal enough to make it probable at all. It is a fascinating book, and it's real good in the areas of the book, and there's a lot of it, where he kind of summarizes how archaeology in the Middle East was able to go back further and further with new discoveries. And I thought it was really a fascinating work. It's truly scholarly. It just seems to me it doesn't make the case it's trying to make. I've never read the other ones. But still got the 12th Planet on the shelf over there. It is fascinating reading. And then finally from Brian, have you read The Preacher comic book series? It's a series about a preacher who loses faith and gets possessed by a hybrid demon. He and his hitman girlfriend and a vampire go around in search of God so he can give them answers. No, I'm vague. Garth Ennis, I think. I've heard of it. I've seen the covers, but I love comics, but I'm more into conventional superheroes, and so I'm sure it's well worth reading. Maybe one day I will get around to it. I appreciate the recommendation. It does sound like fun, and I think I've heard of a movie in the works based on The Preacher. Thanks, Brian. David Oliver Smith. I've heard you express over the years that you're skeptical of the authenticity of Secret Mark. I was looking at Morton Smith's translation, quote-unquote, of this strange pericope yesterday, and I share your skepticism. By the way, you ever notice if you try to type pericope, which means like a self-contained gospel passage, your computer never heard of that and automatically corrects it to periscope? You better take a second look, because you can't let it get away with that. That's almost as good as that computer translation of Bruno Bauer's book, Christ and the Caesars, where the spell check didn't recognize the name Titus and substituted tiptoes. Oh boy. Anyway, okay, David says, first, there seem to be too many phrases found in other pericopai in canonical Mark. I was just talking about this, right? For instance, prostrated herself before Jesus. Son of David, have mercy on me. The disciples rebuked her, and those three are just in the first 10% of the pericope. It is chock full of familiar Markan phrases. Second, the passage says, but the disciples rebuked her, and Jesus, being angered, went off with her into the garden. This seems out of character for Mark's Jesus, who, when he is angered or frustrated, directly confronts those who have caused these negative emotions. Third, as Michael A. Turton, Turton, has shown in his fascinating online book, Historical Commentary on the Gospel of Mark, essentially every pericope originally written by the author of Mark has a tight chiastic structure. There are exceptions which Turton suspects are later interpolations. For example, the Syrophoenician woman, the death of John the Baptist, the leaven of the Pharisees, and one of the feeding miracles. By the way, let me point out that, three of those occur in the miracle catena, or miracle chain, that Paul Achtemeier pointed out. That's parallel to a roughly equivalent second series, cheek by jowl with it, in Mark. And Luke leaves one whole chain of them out, which might mean that it wasn't there in the copy of Mark he used, which both of those things make it look not unlikely that all those passages are interpolated. Okay, and the death of John the Baptist, I believe Frank Zindler has an interesting argument that is an interpolation. And of course, that doesn't have anything to do with this, so this would be considered, I guess, sort of a corroboration. Okay, the signature of the signature of a Markan pericope is a chiastic center containing two hemi-stitches that make the literary point in a long and short version. The shorter summary is usually very pithy. As an example, and the chiastic structure, the first line or notion is recapped by the last one. The second matches the second to last, and then there's a couple more. If there are more in between, it's like an accordion in the same order that one reflects the other. Okay, as an example, A, 10:13, and they were bringing to him little children so that he would teach them. And you jump down to 10:17, also A. And going on the journey, one ran up to him and kneeled before him and asked him, "Good teacher, what should I do that I may inherit eternal life?" Back up to the second half of 10:13, B. And the disciples admonished them. Jumping down to 10:16, B prime, I guess it would be. And he took them in his arms and blessed them, laying his hands upon them. Going up to 10:14, C would be, but Jesus, seeing it, became indignant and said to them, "Allow the little children to come to me. Do not forbid them, for the kingdom of God the world of God belongs to such as these." And then you jump down to C prime in the very next verse, 10:15. "Truthfully I say to you, whoever will not receive the world of God as a little child, there's no way he will enter into it." The AA prime stitch shows movement in and out of the pericope, with the A prime hemi stitch becoming the A stitch of the next pericope and interlocking the two. The B prime stitch has the disciples admonishing the crowd and Jesus welcoming the children, showing how not to treat people and how to treat them. The C prime stitch is the center of the structure and makes the point twice, with a long version and a short summary one, a summary that one must be like a child to enter the kingdom of God. In Secret Mark, the tight center is not found. I would divide the pericope thusly. A. And they came to Bethany. Then down at the bottom, A prime, and thence arising he returned to the other side of the Jordan. Back up to B. And a certain woman whose brother had died was there, and coming she prostrated herself before Jesus and says to him, Son of David, have mercy on me. Down to the bottom, but one, B prime. And he remained with him that night, for Jesus taught him the mystery of the kingdom of God. Back up to third from the top, C. But the disciples rebuked her, and Jesus, being angered, went off with her into the garden where the tomb was, and straightway a great cry was heard from the tomb. Down to C prime. And after 6 days Jesus told them what to do, and in the evening the youth comes to him wearing a linen cloth over his naked body. Back up to D. And going near, Jesus rolled away the stone from the door of the tomb. Down to D prime. And going out of the tomb, they came into the house of the youth, for he was rich. Going up to E. And straightway going in where the youth was, he stretched forth his hand and raised him, seizing his hand. And then immediately E prime. But the youth, looking upon him, loved him, and began to beseech him that he might be with him. There is movement into and out of the pericope, forming the tentative A prime stitch. There seems to be no relationship between the tentative B and B prime hemistitches, except that they contain the name Jesus. Likewise with the C prime stitch. Both the D and the D prime hemistitches do contain information about the tomb, but the E prime stitch does not have the signature short, long statements making the same literary point. In fact, the point of the pericope seems to be in the B prime stitch and not in the center. That is, and he remained with him that night, for Jesus taught him the mystery of the kingdom of God, which is a more modern construction. In ancient literary compositions, the turning point or recognition comes at the center of the piece, and the rest is denouement. I couldn't help feeling after rereading Secret Mark yesterday that Morton Smith originally intended it as a joke. Jesus taught the youth the mystery of the kingdom of God, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, and it got out of hand. A final point, it's the famous Jesus Christ super gay theory. A final point in the letter of Clement of Alexandria, which Morton Smith discovered, explaining Secret Mark. Clement says that this pericope fits in between Mark 10:34 and 10:35. Isn't it more likely that something was snipped out of Mark between 1046 and 1046b? 1046a and 1046b? Maybe that was too obvious for Morton Smith. What thinketh the geek? You're probably right. I have to admit that, as you know, Dave, my poor brain somehow has trouble processing the whole chiastic thing. It's almost as bad as Bayesian probability for my limited noggin here, but it sounds right, and I similarly challenged a defender of the authenticity of Secret Mark, who argued that it shows the sandwiching technique of composition in Mark, and I don't think it does. So yeah, I think you're right. I mean, as I've said before, I'd love it for the secret gospel to be authentic. It would fit in with some theories of mine, but I really doubt that it is. It seems to me very likely that it was a kind of a joke and a test that Smith created to see if fellow New Testament scholars could pick up on what was happening. Acapulco J says, did the followers of Crestus have fewer cavities? Sorry about that. Well, you know, I think certain faith healers today must think so, because they do divine filling of teeth on stage. Oh my God. Anyway, secondly, does the Bible talk about natural selection as per Darwin's concept? If Darwin was right, is it reflected in any biblical transcripts or any ancient writings or scrolls? I don't think so. I guess the closest you could say this gets is that that Genesis does not deny the possibility of transition between species, as some people think it does, because they say, well, look, it says this and that critter was fruitful and produced offspring after its own kind. Well, that means that you wouldn't see a frog suddenly giving birth to a lizard. Yeah, that's true, but Darwin would agree with you. Evolution doesn't say that's what would happen, right? And but that's very far. However, Anaximander and some others of the ancient pre-Socratics did believe in a kind of evolution. They said that human beings, as they're presently constituted, are too vulnerable and dependent for such a long time that if we had started this way, we would never have survived. So we must be developed from a hardier species. Well, in general, I think people would agree with that today. I mean, we don't have much hair, but our forebears sure did, and they must have been hulking brutes, and we're namby-pamby weaklings. I am, anyway. And so forth. Of course, what they didn't know was the mechanism of evolution, the tandem process of mutation and natural selection. I don't think there's anything about that in ancient sources, but I could be wrong. Thanks, Jay. Let me see here. This is from Saif Asad al-Satya, whose pen name is half Arabic, half Sanskrit. Pretty neat. Regarding a question from Reuven in your March 27, 2015 episode, about 17 minutes in, asking about the Quran, Surah 33, verse 4. Muhammad is the father of no man among you. He is the apostle of Allah and the seal of the prophets. This is almost certainly related to the story of Muhammad's adopted son, Zayd bin Haritha. It's remarkable that this Zayd is the only one of the Prophet's companions who is mentioned by name in the Quran. The rest are described only in the Hadith, like Abu Bakr, Uthman, and so on. And indeed, most of Zayd's story is only to be found in Hadith. The story is that Zayd married one of the most beautiful women around, and the Prophet himself fell in love with her after accidentally seeing her in a state of partial undress. This reminds anybody of David and Bathsheba. However, it was strictly forbidden for a father to marry the wife of his son, even if the son and his wife were to divorce. Fortunately for Muhammad, God revealed to him at this point that actually all adoptions are forbidden, and therefore the marriage rules can be ignored in this case. So Zayd divorced his wife, and Muhammad married her. Muhammad is the father of no man among you, emphasizes the point that Zayd does not count as a son. Later, Zayd died leading troops into battle after Muhammad had some sort of premonition that the leader of those troops would die, which Muhammad supposedly felt bad about. I learned about this from a fascinating interview with David Powers, the author of a book titled Muhammad is Not the Father of Any of Your Men, The Making of the Last Prophet. Listeners can readily find the interview by searching Google for David Powers, New Books in Islamic Studies. Tom Holland, in another fascinating interview, suggests that the Muhammad is the father of no man among you passage was added at some point early on to combat claims of authority by local leaders who said they were descended from the prophet's sons. This would, of course, be very similar to the claims that the Shiite imams made, except that all known Shiite groups have had to make do with descent only through Muhammad's daughter, rather than a son. I started to wonder if there might have been some connection between Zayd, the adopted son of Muhammad, and the Zaydi Shiite sect, the Fivers, that has been in the news lately due to the civil war in Yemen. The Zaydis were supposedly founded by a different Zayd, the son of the fourth Shiite Imam, but I speculate that perhaps their origin story was rearranged early on when they were compelled to accept the Orthodox Quran that explicitly declares that Muhammad was no man's father. The Tom Holland interview, which was on an Australian broadcasting company program, can also be found on Google by searching for Tom Holland Late Night Live. That is great stuff, Saif. I never would have known that in a million years, and I really appreciate your digging this up for us. I think that's probably Reuven's answer. I'd like to hear what he thinks. And Reed Braden, I watched your latest panel on YouTube with Carrier and Fitzgerald. Excellent as ever. I have a question about something you said in defense of Q. You said one of the reasons you continue to accept the Q hypothesis is that other hypotheses still manage to sneak in a few other hypothetical sources, L and M, for example. Wouldn't the Farrar hypothesis, it always drives me crazy that you spell it F-A-R-R-E-R, but I believe it's pronounced Farrar. Anyway, wouldn't the Farrar hypothesis, currently argued by Mark Goodacre, explain the origin of the synoptics well enough without any additional hypotheticals? Why can't the Q material simply be where Matthew is crafting his own narrative outside of Mark, and Luke is coming along later to copy and redact it? Cthulhu Fatagan, Reed Braden. Well, my problem there is that Luke is so different from Matthew, where they overlapped subject-wise, like a nativity and a resurrection, that I just don't see any reason to think that one is based on the other. If it is, it's so thoroughly rewritten that there really aren't any fingerprints on it that I can see. I'm sure people have items they can point to, but it sure doesn't look that way to me. And I do think Luke and Matthew made up quite a bit of what is unique to them. But it's the problem there is, in my opinion, that there's no real reason to think that Luke was rewriting Matthew, and seems just arbitrary to me. Could be wrong. I mean, certainly could be. But I'm surprised, actually, Mark Goodacre, who's generally sort of conservative, would go that far, because that sure is. I'm glad he does, but that sure does entail a view of the Gospels as not very historical. But I'll keep thinking about it. Believe it or not, folks, that's the bottom of the rain barrel. I actually did it. So I hope you'll be sending in more questions, and if you can send in any donations, we can sure use them for the old family budget. Car repair today and all kinds of nonsense. But at any rate, I'm glad I wrapped it up. I hopefully won't amass such a huge continent of late questions again, but at least I've done my duty today, and so I'll see you pretty soon, I'm sure, and it's up to you, on another exciting episode of the Bible Geek.